Grandpa did not rise to his usual heights of FDR denunciation. He seemed tired and sad. After supper, he led the usual Bible reading and prayer, and then lay down on the couch by the stove, remarking he felt a bit under the weather. He maintained a thoughtful quiet all evening, and then went early to bed. Grandma, when Mama wrote out for her what had happened to the 2 banks, chose to look on the bright side. "Well, now we know the bank in town is safe from a run. That's very good, isn't it?" Then she, too, lapsed into silence. Not until Grandpa's estate was settled after his death in 1952 did we learn what had really happened that night. Grandpa's life savings had been in the failed Mountain Grove Bank. Grandma's inheritance money was safely held in the Bank of Kabul. The choice of completely separate banks was probably a settlement of years of bickering between them over whether the husband had the right to control the wife's money. Neither of them chose to share that or any other financial information with us, their dependent family. Was it Grandpa's pride that made him unable to acknowledge his loss? Or was he trying to shield us from the knowledge that he too was now at risk? I still wonder. Roosevelt's draconian bank holiday did stop the headlines on bank failures, but I certainly never heard Grandpa say a good word for it. Next thing I knew, the talk was all of Blue Eagles, and I saw Blue Eagle signs posted on most of the storefronts as I walked on Main Street. The Blue Eagle was the emblem of the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. My 8-year-old brain never comprehended in the least how the National Industrial Recovery Act was supposed to work. All I knew was that the Blue Eagle, which I at first had admired as a beautiful drawing, turned fierce and frightening as Grandpa talked about it. "That FDR and his brain trust, they'll tinker us right into a planned economy, and that'll be the end of freedom in this country, mark my words. Blue Eagle indeed, it's the mark of the beast." In addition to the regular newspaper, Grandpa subscribed to several extremely conservative newsletters. In one of those newsletters, he found an article relating the Blue Eagle to the end of the world, the apocalypse. He became so excited he spent the whole of our supper time that evening reading the article aloud and comparing it with sections in the book of Revelation. I remember the article's author arrived at some of his conclusions by counting the tips of the feathers in the outspread wings of the eagle and relating them to numbers referred to by the Revelator. Prior to that evening, Grandpa had been humble with respect to Revelation, admitting there were mysteries in the book that were hard to interpret, but carried away by his loathing for Roosevelt, he became utterly convinced that FDR was the Antichrist, and lo, the end of the world was at hand. For our regular Bible reading that night, he read a whole chapter from Revelation, and I went to bed one thoroughly frightened little girl. I was still frightened the next day at school. At lunchtime, I told my best friend Edna all about the mark of the beast and the horseman and the end of the world and how we were all going to die. And Edna and I were frightened together, but the telling didn't help. By the time I rode the school bus home, I was in a terrible state. I found Mama in the kitchen and burst into tears. "Mama, I don't want us to die like the Bible says." Mama stopped her work and sat down with me, comforted and soothed me, and explained that the man who wrote the article could be all wrong, and Grandpa could be too, and people had believed the world was about to end many times before, but it never had ended, so I shouldn't worry. Reassured, I dried my tears, ate my after-school snack, and never again worried about the apocalypse. The National Industrial Recovery Act was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and the Blue Eagles fluttered into trash bins and out of the national psyche. Meanwhile, the Roosevelt administration set up agencies that Grandpa derisively called FDR's alphabet soup. CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps; AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration; WPA, Works Progress Administration; PWA, Public Works Administration; and a dozen, or was it dozens, of other entities designed to put the unemployed to work on government projects or deal with the farm crisis. A large CCC camp sprouted almost overnight in the forest a few miles from Kabul, and on Saturday nights, uniformed young men from the camp wandered about Main Street, went to the movie theater, or hung out at the newly opened, since repeal of Prohibition, beer hall. "The Democrats are going to bankrupt this country," Grandpa stormed. "Millions of dollars for boondoggles. Do you know how long it takes to count out 1,000,000? I didn't, but someone writing in the paper had worked it out, and no human being could live long enough to complete the job. I puzzled for a long time over how the government could spend $1,000,000 when no one could count it. Soon we heard the WPA was going to build a farm-to-market road south from town, running for a distance along the eastern boundary of Grandpa's farm. Daddy quietly went to town, applied for a job on the WPA road gang, and got it. Grandpa grumbled but held his peace. The job lasted for only a few months, but it paid for needed clothes and gave us a cash reserve that continued to sustain us for some time. Grandpa paid us no money for our work on the farm, so although we had food and shelter, we were otherwise penniless. So it went. In 1936, Roosevelt was elected to a second term by an overwhelming majority, although unemployment was still at 16.9%, down from 23.6% in 1932. I don't remember those figures. I just now looked them up in the Time Almanac. But I do remember the reality, our reality. And was Daddy ever represented in those figures? Probably not. During the 2 years he hung on in St. Louis, he was briefly a sales representative for the Dunkel Oil Company, then struggled trying to sell Electrolux vacuum cleaners door to door. So he would have been listed as a salesman. After his return to his father's farm, he would have been considered a farmer. Grandpa continued to revile Roosevelt, and Daddy to search for ingenious ways to make a buck on the side. He knew he had to find a way to make something from nothing, and he thought he'd found it, a truly bootstrap operation. Kabul had no garbage pickup. Householders would be happy to give their garbage to anyone who would pick it up. Razorback hogs could be fattened on the garbage, then sold for a profit. Ergo, he would become a garbage man hog farmer. He had enough money left from the WPA job to buy the initial bunch of hogs at the auction yard. He went to the Kabul bank with his proposal. The bank lent him the money to buy a second-hand pickup truck for running the garbage business, and he was in business. The plan worked. We had high hopes for independence, and in the summer of 1938, the business was wiped out by hog cholera. End of Operation Bootstrap.